The time, 4:30 a.m. My daughter and I, we get up very quietly so as not to disturb our sleep-loving family members. And we proceed to make the 20-minute trek to the edge of the Grand Canyon. We set up our chairs. I've got my camera and tripod. And we get to experience a glorious sunrise over the Grand Canyon. I took this picture probably about 30 minutes after the sun first began to peek over the edge of the canyon. Now, I don't know about you, but I think most people, when they stare into this great chasm, when they look at this massive hole in the ground, they're very introspective, right? It makes you think about things other than just, well, all right, I saw it, what's for breakfast, right? We have big thoughts. I certainly thought about a lot of things, and you can probably guess what one of them was. And that is, what do young Earth creationists think when they come up to the edge of this canyon? They look into it and they ask themselves, how was this made? And they know in their mind how it must have been made, right? It's a post-flood event. But do they really ask themselves, does this actually look like something that's only 4,000 years old? Or had I stumbled upon this canyon before anyone else had seen it, or I didn't know anything about it, and I hadn't read anything about it, and nobody told me anything about this canyon, and I were to come across this canyon in my travels, would I immediately jump to the conclusion that this is simply a couple thousand-year-old geological formation? Or would I look at it, I would look at that river down at the base of it, and I would be overwhelmed with the idea that this probably took a long time to make. This is an ancient thing I'm staring into. This is a little bit of what I want to get into today. Now, I want to come at this from a particular direction. And the direction is we're going to look at some things that Ken Coulson has said, Dr. Ken Coulson has said on his YouTube station. Ken Coulson is, I'll call him kind of a fringe young Earth creationist in the sense that he doesn't work for any of the major organizations. And in a way, he's kind of an outcast from young Earth creationism because Ken Ham has written Ken Ham's henchmen have written a couple articles about Ken Coulson, labeling him a young Earth evolutionist, along with a number of other young Earth creationists, right? This dangerous strand of thought within young Earth creationism that Ken Ham believes is a danger to the rest of the young Earth creationist world. And I want to point out what I think is something of a division, a dividing line between this set of young Earth creationists, which he has called young Earth evolutionists, what I call the new creationists. So without further ado, let's ask the question, do the observations of the world around us naturally draw us to the conclusion that the world is young, apart from any knowledge of Scripture? Or does the world appear old, and we simply have to reinterpret that data as being young because of the presupposition that the world is young based on an interpretation of Scripture? That's the distinction that's being made between some young Earth creationists. Let's take a look at that coming up. Okay, so here we go. Recently, I was watching a YouTube video by Ken Coulson on his YouTube station, Creation Unfolding. I really highly recommend, if you want to know interesting ideas and concepts and interactions with the world of young Earth creationism, Ken Coulson is really a person to watch. And he explored this idea of, can science alone prove that the universe is young? If all you had was scientific tools and you just looked at the evidence and you had no other presuppositions, you didn't come in with any particular viewpoint on whether the world was old or young, and you were to examine the world around you, would you come to the conclusion that the world is very ancient, or you conclude that it is recently appeared? It's a really good question. And he explores that in this video, and he begins by using this quote. If a person were given science tools but had no preconceived notions about the universe, would purely objective observations lead that person to believe in a billion years old Earth and universe? By no means, since so many features look so young. What Ken Coulson points out here is that many young Earth creationist leaders leave the idea in their followers' minds that this is true, that so many features look young, that I've heard actual young Earth creationist speakers say all the evidence points to a young Earth. Now, there might be a caveat there that all the evidence points to it if you have the right mindset and the worldview, that you come with a preconceived notion, right? Then you will be able to look at the evidence and be able to interpret it as looking young. But that's not the way it sounds in a lot of talks. And even when Ken Ham speaks sometimes, he often throws up a whole bunch of here's a whole bunch of evidence. These are obvious things in nature that show that the world is young. You don't need to have the Bible. It happens to be that the Bible also shows that the world is young. But it's an evidential approach saying, look, here's all this evidence the world's young. Oh, look, the Bible also says the world's young. Therefore, you should believe the Bible. Right? Ken Ham uses sort of a presuppositional approach and an evidentialist apologetics approach at the same time, right? Because really he's mostly a presuppositionalist, right? That you presuppose the world is young based on your interpretation of Genesis. And therefore you need to manipulate all the data or reinterpret all the data in the context of that particular truth, right? You presuppose. Okay, but backing up a little bit ahead of myself already. Ken Coulson is using this quote to point out and criticize a lot of young Earth creationists for essentially telling their audience that you can just look at the world and see that the world is young. And as a result, you're hearing all these scientists say that the world looks old. And they're just crazy because obviously if you look at the world, it's young. Why would anyone think that the world is old? And he says this is a wrong approach because he thinks that the average person, maybe not knowing the presuppositions that the world is young and able to look at that evidence in different eyes and reinterpret that data for themselves, but if they just naturally look at the world using basic science tools or evidential tools, they're probably not going to come to the conclusion that the world is old. And I'm going to show you a couple examples later that are kind of intuitive examples that would not lead you to an idea that the world is young, but rather that it's old. Right? So he's starting out with this quote, and this quote actually comes from Henry Morris in 2002 in the biblical basis for modern science. And so Henry Morris here is suggesting that, even if you didn't have any preconceived notions, you would still conclude or could see that the world is young or might come to that conclusion because there's so many different features that appear young. Ken Coulson doesn't really think that that's the case. And a number of other young Earth creationists are willing to admit that at first glance, the intuitive answer, the obvious answer is that many objects on the Earth and the universe look extremely old. Now, of course, Ken Coulson doesn't actually think that they're actually that old, but he admits that the universe looks old. Now, he has a number of interpretive ways of trying to understand how things could look old and not be old. But for now, we're just going to acknowledge that he does admit that the world looks old. And therefore, we shouldn't be poking fun at scientists who may not understand scriptures and not understand the biblical word that God has given us that says that the world is young. Without having that knowledge, why would we expect them to come to the idea that the world is young? The world doesn't actually look young. They're not naturally drawn to that. Right? And it's not that they're running away from God, right? It's not that they're scared to admit that God is right. It's like if you're a scientist and you don't know anything about the God of the Bible, right? And you look at the evidence around you, look at the world around you, you're going to conclude most likely that the world is an ancient thing. So a little bit about Ken Coulson real quickly. His YouTube station is Creation Unfolding, and he's had a number of different videos lately, which are quite interesting. The one I'm actually looking at here is, Can Science Alone Prove That the Universe is Young? We're only just going to take a few snapshots of that, and then I'm going to go off on a tangent. A month ago, he talks about what makes a young Earth creationist, right? That's a really good question. I think he does a very good job at defining what are the qualities of a young Earth creationist. And what he's doing there is he's defending his own credentials as a young Earth creationist because he's been attacked by Answers in Genesis and others for essentially calling him not a young Earth creationist, right? Just a little bit about Ken Coulson, because this is just my opportunity to sort of give him a shout out and talk a little bit about how he fits into the rest of the young earth creationist world. Ken Coulson has a PhD in earth science from Loma Linda University. That's out in California. That is a Seventh-day Adventist institution. Ken Coulson is a Seventh-day Adventist. He's just recently moved back to his hometown of Brisbane, Australia. Interestingly, Brisbane is where Martin Iles comes from, the recent hire for Answers in Genesis. So Martin Iles is coming over here. Ken Coulson is going back to Brisbane. And his YouTube station is called Creation Unfolding, which refers to the name of his book. Really fascinating book on young earth creationism, exploring some topics that lots of young earth creationists never talk about. So that's why I found that book especially interesting. And you can see his subtitle to his station is Young Earth Creationism is Changing. All right, it's talking about the work of George McCready Price. Well, George McCready Price is a Seventh-day Adventist and is one of the originators, really, of, say, flood geology. All right, so let's read really quickly the description here. Young Earth creationism is changing, right? And that's the thing that Ken Ham's getting. Ken Ham's trying to keep young Earth creationism the same, right? And Ken Coulson is part of this sort of changing of the guard of young Earth creationism, or what I call the new creationist. As he says here, the work of George McCready Price, Henry Morris, John Whitcomb was truly revolutionary in its time. But in recent decades, many young Earth creationist scientists have grown increasingly dissatisfied with some of their scientific models. Yeah, I mean, all those have come under a large amount of criticism, even amongst, I'll say, mainstream young Earth creationists. But mostly this word, people willing to really talk about this are sort of outside the mainstream young Earth creationist organizations. This newer generation of young Earth creationists is a bit of a throwback to the scriptural geologists of the 19th century, in that many established scientific constructs, such as the reality of the geological column, are given serious consideration. Unlike mainstream creationists, this group recognizes that modern-day young Earth creationism has some serious shortcomings, and as such, is not afraid to say, "I don't know," when answers to tough questions are found wanting. This group seeks to propose new, fresh ideas, which will hopefully answer some of the tougher questions without compromising God's word. Creation Unfolding is strongly aligned with this burgeoning community of young Earth creationist scientists. And I think that the community he's referring to, or the group that he's referring to, are those like Kurt Wise and Todd Wood and those bloggers who are at, say, the New Creation blog, and a variety of other independent creationists that maybe are professors at small colleges and so forth, right? Essentially all the ones that are labeled under the moniker that Answers in Genesis has given them of young Earth evolution, or under the influence of evolutionary thinking. They're certainly not, evolutionists in any sense of the word that most people are thinking, because they still believe in separate creation of kinds and a young Earth. But nonetheless, they've been sort of outcast for some of their other views and for their criticism of other young Earth creationists. And as you can see that right here, that this group recognizes that there's some serious shortcomings in the current models, all right? And the current models would be like the primary positions of Answers in Genesis, Institute for Creation Research, and Creation Ministries International. Right, now this video is part of a couple video series that Ken Coulson has done, which has been a response to Answers in Genesis series of articles. They had a series of 11 articles earlier this year, all about what they call young Earth evolution. And one of those articles, in fact, one of the very early articles was called, "Is There Ambiguity in Creation?" Right? Would God create the earth so that scientific investigation would yield seeming evidence of evolution in millions and billions of years? Of course, Answers in Genesis answer is no. There shouldn't be any evidence that the world is old, right? All that evidence can be reinterpreted, and it should look young. If you put the right worldview glasses on, you would see that evidence as all pointing to a young Earth. These new creationists, and I don't want to paint them all in this broad brush because they may not all feel this way, but many of them I know feel like, yes, it's understandable why some look at the world and think that it's old. Some look up at the universe and When they measure things, their measurements suggest that the universe is ancient. We shouldn't think it's silly for people to think that the world looks old, including Christians who are young earth creationists and stand at the Grand Canyon. It shouldn't be surprising that they may have the thought, this looks like it's really old. And I can say maybe because it really is. Ken Coulson's not going to say that, but he's going to admit it does look old. All right? So this is a quote from Coulson by the author that wrote this article for Answers in Genesis. I've become increasingly aware that some glaring problems within mainstream young earth creationism that stem from what I believe is an overly suspicious approach to conventional science. Exacerbating the problems are a plethora of online young earth creationist websites that are hosted by well-meaning Christians who are neither scientists nor theologians. Yes, there's a whole lot of those. These websites claim that scientific evidence abounds for the youth of the creation and that a belief in millions of years is nothing more than propaganda. Right? Certainly on YouTube, chat and Twitter and Facebook and you can find people all the time that simply just mock people for thinking that the world is old, as if that's some kind of crazy thought, right? That you're just falling for propaganda. All right? It's all just cooked up by biased evolutionists. We're out there to just deceive the world at large. So in their minds, the young earth creationist interpretation of nature is obvious. Right? It should just be obvious to everybody. Even if you don't believe the Bible, you should just look at the world and it looks young. And the only reason you think it looks old is because you have been brainwashed. Right? Only a fool would fall for this secular view that believes the earth is 4.6 billion years old. Now, Ken Coulson is saying, no, it's not foolish to believe this. This is an overly suspicious approach to conventional science, as if it's just out there to go against the Word of God. So does the earth look old? Well, part of Coulson's solution to remedy this issue is to first acknowledge the evidence does exist supporting the antiquity of the earth. Right? That's what Coulson says. He does say in his book, we need to acknowledge that the evidence does support the antiquity of the earth. There is abundant evidence that the world is old. But of course, given Coulson's claim to be young earth creationists, this statement may sound surprising to many young earth creationists. Well, yes, because many young earth creationist leaders have brainwashed their followers into thinking that this is true, that all the evidence points to a young earth, and that there isn't any evidence for an ancient earth. How can young earth creationists believe there's evidence for the antiquity of the earth? Coulson comes to this conclusion by considering geophysical processes that presently sustain our planet. So, quoting from Coulson, by estimating the current volume of Earth's continental rocks and then extrapolating back the current rate at which these rocks are being formed, one can easily approximate a time for the Earth's formation in the millions and billions of years. That is not an unreasonable statement by Coulson, right? Looking at all those rocks, extrapolating back from the current rate, you get millions and billions of years. You stand in the Grand Canyon, you look down into the canyon, you see the river that's there. You can figure out how much sediment is loaded into that river and that it's carrying away. You can watch over many years how much erosion is occurring to the walls of the Grand Canyon. You can extrapolate back and you're going to get it's millions of years. Right? That's a form of evidence that the world is old. Now, you may choose to say, I'm going to reinterpret that evidence. I'm going to believe that processes in the past were far faster than they are today. But that's something you're going to have to find additional evidence for. It's not intuitive that the processes would necessarily have been so much different in the past than they are in the present. And remember, we started out with this idea that, from Morris, that if you just didn't have any presuppositions and you were just given scientific tools, like I can just look at erosion rates, I can measure sediments in rivers, right? I can look at how much rock is falling down, right, off the face of these mountains. If you just took those measurements, Henry Morris seems to think that you would still conclude that the world is young because the evidence points to a young Earth, because there's so many different ways that evidence suggests the world is young. Ken Coulson and other new creationists or young Earth evolutionists are acknowledging that on the face of it, the simplest explanation for the data, for much of the evidence, is that you would interpret it naturally as indicating that the world is old. What Coulson does in his video is he says, all right, Answers in Genesis, Ken Ham, others at other young earth creationist organizations like to talk about how there's so much evidence for a young earth, that the evidence points to a young earth, right? That it naturally points that direction. And that all the evidence should point in that direction. But then he goes and he uses Andrew Snelling and other evidence from Answers in Genesis itself to show that they themselves don't really believe that, right? Talks about all the vast amount of erosion that must occur. He quotes from Snelling and talks about all this amount of erosion that has occurred. And Snelling himself actually says, and the equivalent of hundreds of thousands, if not hundreds of millions of years of erosion must have occurred in this very short period of time. And sometimes appealing to miracles, right? To do that. Now, that's an appeal to the Bible, right? That's an appeal to presuppositionalism. I presuppose that the earth is young. Therefore, I see this thing and it looks like millions of years of erosion, but I'm going to compress it into a short period of time. So that is evidence that the world is old, right? If you interpret in the most natural way. But if you say, well, I'm going to have to reinterpret that data, but then you can get to a young earth. But that's not what somebody naturally does, right? You wouldn't, without any other biases, if you didn't have the scriptures and you just had these tools and you had your basic logic skills, right? You would look at the evidence around you and you would extrapolate back how long it would take to get to where you're at today, and it would be millions of years. Ken Coulson also talks a lot in his book about the original creation and how Andrew Snelling tries to wrap up the separation of the original core of the earth, right? Massive movements of heat and also the separation of various elements into the various structures, right? And saying that only happened in a single day, but acknowledging that really physically couldn't happen. And so you have to compress all that into some sort of like accelerated, unnatural mechanism, right? In other words, some kind of miracle. But the geophysicist trying to understand the origins of the earth, right? Just understanding how the world works is not going to come to the conclusion that the world is young. Right? They're going to come to the conclusion the world is old. And as Ken Coulson says, and as Todd Wood has said and others, I mean, you can't make fun of secular scientists for coming to those very obvious and intuitive answers. Yeah, I sense I'm really struggling to communicate the ideas that are in my head this evening, but let's try 3 examples of, I think, intuitive examples of where simple observations of nature don't lead one down the path to saying, oh, the world is young, but rather make you scratch your head and go like, wow, the world looks like it's really quite old, right? That support the ideas of Ken Ham and of some of the other new creationists, that we just have to admit that the world to the average person who thinks about the world and investigates it all is going to come to the conclusion that the world is old. So, first example. James Hutton, 1700s, sometimes called the father of geology. And he's also known for the phrase, the present is the key to the past. By studying present processes, we can look at things in geology, all right, physical features of the world, and we can extrapolate from present processes and the rates of those processes in the present to how long it took to form that particular thing we're seeing in the present day. In this particular case, we're looking at the destruction of something that was a known formation, except it was a man-made formation, right? Hadrian's Wall, right? Separating England and the north of Great Britain. Not Great Britain at the time, but so AD 122 to 128. We have it's a fairly firm date in terms of when the Hadrian's Wall was made over a series of years. Right? So we know the age of this particular wall. So you could go visit Hadrian's Wall And you would know you're looking at something that is almost 2,000 years old. All right? James Hutton realized how old that was even in the 1700s. He had some idea of this age range. Right? And you look at this wall and you realize it doesn't look like a freshly made wall. Right? I think we'd all agree. You walk up the wall and you go like, that wasn't made yesterday. Then you ask yourself, was that made 10 years ago? And you're like, no. And then besides, I have actual historical records. I know it wasn't made 10 years ago. Right? I have eyewitness reports of this thing being here 100 years ago, and it didn't look like it was brand new. But if you go back, a couple hundred years, it didn't look just like this. This is more eroded than it was a couple hundred years ago. And clearly the wall is quite eroded compared to its original state. And so that led him to this really simple idea. All right. Okay. We know what this object, this wall looked like 2,000 years ago. And it's made up of these particular types of stones. All right. This particular type of rock of a particular composition. And now we can look at the wall today and we can see how much is eroded. So you can reshape the wall and say, like, here's the original configuration and this much rock is missing. Well, where did it go? Well, it eroded, right? It's raining, it's freezing, it's thawing, right? There's wind, abrasion on it. There's people walking on it potentially. There's animals climbing over it. There's plants growing on it, which its roots are then disrupting the rock and eroding it, right? Even chemicals being produced by the roots, right? So there's a variety of different ways that can be eroded. And so what he did was he estimated what is the rate of erosion of this wall. You notice there's somebody there spraying it. That's because they're probably likely spraying it with some kind of plant retardant, right? And moss retardant, because that's going to break down the wall faster. So they're trying to preserve it today. In other words, what we're trying to do is we're trying to slow down the erosion rate. But presumably up to the 1700s, the erosion rate was probably relatively consistent, right? Because there wasn't any efforts to try to protect it. And so it went from a fresh new wall produced at age 0 to something that's aged 1700. And he determined the amount of mass that was lost from Hadrian's Wall, from a section of Hadrian's Wall. And from that, it's just pretty simple math. You can figure out how much erosion happened per year on average, right? And so then you have a calculation of here's how much rock can erode of this particular rock formation. And that's so the key, the past is, the present is the key to the past. In this case, he knew the past, all right? So he had a marker. But then what he did was he applied it to something where we don't know the age of it, right? We knew the age of the wall, so we could estimate an erosion rate. Then he looked at something like this. In Scotland, there is a volcano called Arthur's Seat volcano. And I know it doesn't look like a whole lot like a volcano today, but this was recognized by early geologists as being all volcanic in origin. The rock is all volcanic in origin. And it would have been a much larger mountain at the time. And so what he was able to do here was be able to figure out what was the approximate shape of something like a mountain like this. And then determine how much rock has eroded away. Like how much rock is missing now that once was there. And then he could take something like his crude estimate of the erosion rate. Actually, it's not that crude. A fairly accurate estimate of the erosion of Hadrian's Wall. Of course, the composition of the rocks of this volcano aren't exactly the same, so the erosion rates wouldn't be completely equivalent, but it's a rough idea. You take this erosion rate now, and you say, okay, well, if this amount of rock can erode per year, and we have this mountain, and it's missing this much mass, how long would it take to erode that much mass? And he came up with a very large number. Actually, I can't remember the number now, but it's more than hundreds of thousands of years, right? And this is an early evidence that the world is much older than one might think, or one had been led to believe up to that point. And of course, what one would been led to believe was essentially scriptural information leading to a generalized belief among people that the world was less than 10,000 years old. Now, of course, there was others who were already considering this to be problematic, but somebody who looks at a mountain like this, and even when they start to recognize this was a volcano, and you think about like, well, when was it a volcano? Well, this must have been after the flood when it was a volcano. And then, but now it's completely eroded. I think even without doing the calculations and having some kind of estimate of the erosion rate, your mind wouldn't, unless you thought that the world was young, you would naturally think that this object is less than 4,000 years old. And then when you actually start to apply some scientific evidence to it and you extrapolate back based on erosion rates, you definitely don't come to the conclusion that the world is young. So once again, going back to Morris, if you didn't have the Bible telling you that this is a mountain that evolved, was made after the flood, and actually the Bible doesn't even say that, right? That's an inference by flood geologists and so forth. But if you didn't have the Bible saying that this is less than 6,000 years old, you might easily can come to the conclusion that this is much older. In fact, you probably would come to the conclusion it's much older. I'm running long. Let's skip this example. Let me just go to this story because it's one of my favorites. I am going to use this as, I'm going to explore this much further in a flood geology failure series because I'll devote a whole episode to these particular rocks. But let me try to give you the short version of the story. So Dr. Jay Quaid, is studying this particular area in the Atacama Desert. So this is a very high desert in Chile. As you can see, it's very arid. All right, there's really virtually no life in this particular site. It's just like a moonscape here. And in this location, there's all these scattered boulders. And you can see these very large. Some of these are very, very large boulders. And one of the questions is, if you're a geologist, would be, how do these boulders get where they are right now? You can see there's the side of a hill up there. Obviously, there's more boulders up the side of the hill. In fact, there's large boulders up on the side of the hill, and presumably they're kind of rolling down the hill. But how did they get spread out here? And how old is this particular site? Right? How long did it take for this whole location to develop? You know, in a young Earth creationist scheme, if you wanted to believe that the world is young, right, and all this set before your eyes is something that occurred after the flood, so it's less than 4,500 years old. These mountains are large Andean mountains. They're considered to be post-flood mountains, created after the flood. And so they're created by volcanoes and so forth. So that all had to take some time. Then this all had to cool. Then you have this large valley. I'm not showing the whole valley, but in front of you here, there's a huge flat valley that has many fewer rocks on it. It kind of slopes up on the other side toward another mountain. And so you have this valley. The valley's filled with hundreds of feet of this fine sediment, right, that these boulders are sitting on. So you had to have that sediment formed. That sediment couldn't have been formed by the flood, right? This has to be a post-flood event because the mountains themselves are post-flood. So then there had to be erosion of some of the material from these mountains to create all of this stuff in the center. Meanwhile, there isn't any evidence that it really barely ever, it was one of the driest places on Earth, right? So based on the present, there's not much evidence that there's been any water activity that would help erode this stuff. So basically what you have is you've got wind, right? And you have freezing and thawing, right? Which is helping to crack and erode the rocks. And then there's another phenomena that helps us explain something. So let me tell you about that. I got to show you some of the boulders because you couldn't see it in that previous picture, but there are a lot of boulders scattered around in this valley. And these are very large boulders too. These are, 500 pounds to 5,000 pounds in weight. And you know something strange about these boulders? These boulders have this weird girdle around them of it's smoothed off. The boulders are smoothed off. They're not smooth on top. They're just smooth around the sides. You can see that one in the distance also is smooth around the side. And this is like, it's a real head scratcher. It's like, how did it get that way? How did it get that way? And you think, well, maybe it rolled down the mountain and it smoothed off that way. But that is not a very good hypothesis. You could test that with a variety of different ways. So I love this story because it's sort of about the serendipity that happens in science sometimes. You might not have a hypothesis, but you might be in the right place at the right time and something happens, you make a new observation, and all of a sudden it's like, oh, never thought of that before. And maybe that explains a lot of the observations at this particular site. So what happened was they were there back in, I think it was 2012, with a team investigating some other aspects of this area, the Atacama Desert, and there was an earthquake, right? A fairly large earthquake. And as they stood there among the rocks, they could hear this jiggling sound, and they could hear the tapping of the rocks together. So rocks that were close together were actually moving, and as they moved, they bumped into each other. And suddenly they look at these rocks that have these smooth borders, and they realized, this is actually the rocks bumping into each other, and bumping into each other so many times that they smooth off the sides, right? They're not bumping into each other on top, right? Which explains the tops not having the same texture. The top is just being eroded by heat, cold, a small amount of water, right? Maybe a little wind erosion and so forth, right? But these smooth sides look like it's coming from earthquakes. And I have this little note down here. These rocks have shaken for up to, this is what they estimated, all right? They estimated that these rocks have probably shaken for up to 70,000 hours during their 1.3 million years of existence. All right, so they've determined that this valley is about 1.3 million years old in terms of its present state. It's looked about the same for 1.3 million years. And these rocks have been jiggling down the side of the mountain, right? They're eroding, they're breaking off the side of the rocks on the mountainside. And then they're on these very gentle slopes. Each time there's an earthquake, they jiggle down a little bit farther, all right? And as they do, they're bumping into each other. And then they get out into the valley, the plain valley, and they've moved out into the valley. So now you have these massive rocks sitting out inside the valley. Wind can't push these around. They're too heavy, right? So it's like, how did they get where they are? They've jiggled there by earthquakes. But even an 8.0 earthquake close by is only going to move one of these rocks a couple centimeters at most. So it might take dozens, hundreds, even thousands of years for some of these larger rocks to move 10 meters in order to get next to another one. Then they might spend a couple hundred years next to another rock, and each time there's an earthquake, you get that jiggling. Well, how many earthquakes? How many earthquakes would it take? They did some basic calculations of like, how many times would these things have to touch each other, right? How many times would they have to vibrate and bump into each other to create the amount of erosion that you're seeing on these rocks? And they estimate that's going to take tens of thousands of hours of bumping, all right, against each other to do this. Well, tens of thousands of hours. How are you going to get that? There's not going to be, there's not a large earthquake every 10 minutes in this area, right? It's like every 5 years, there's a decent sized earthquake that's large enough to move any of these rocks. Well, so if you take a look at historical records and you actually say, well, how many earthquakes have there been over the last couple hundred years that are in the appropriate location that would be close enough to this particular site that they would have any effect on these rocks? It's like, okay, well, you have X number, right? And so you get an average per year, or average per decade, or average per 100 years of how many earthquakes you have. And if you were to ask yourself, okay, if I had that many earthquakes over 4,000 years, would that be enough to explain what you're seeing with your eyes here? It'd be like, nope, no way. There's no way. There's simply not enough vibration to create the scene that you're looking at. Right? So again, using present day, we can extrapolate into the past and say, if the same rate of earthquakes occurred, we would end up with nothing like we see 4,000 years ago. We'd have to go back hundreds of thousands of years in order for us to have generated the amount of erosion that we see on the sides of these boulders just by the force of earthquakes and the movement of these rocks bumping into each other. So, how might the young earth creationists respond to this? I mean, God didn't just create these boulders the way they are, right? Unless he did special miracles after the fall. After the flood. These are clearly post-flood rocks, these rocks came from the side of the mountain, right? Where the geochemistry of these rocks is such that they can identify the location up on the side of the mountain where most of these are being generated, right? That's their origin point. But their origin is part of that mountain. But those mountains are the Andes Mountains. And those Andes Mountains were formed, according to all young Earth creationists, especially these higher elevation large mountains, as post-flood events. So you can't use flood to explain this valley and all the sediments in it, right? All the sediment around it. You see how the sediment looks the same as the rocks? That's because these rocks are being pulverized. And lots of the smaller rocks probably were much larger rocks in the past. All right, this big rock right here eventually is going to get pulverized all the way down to nothing. Well, there's hundreds of feet, if not more, of this fine sediment underlying these particular rocks, which all look like to be dust from broken up rocks. When did that happen? Again, if you extrapolate, you're going to get to much greater ages, right? We're saying that 1.3 million years is sort of like how long the present surface has looked like it does. And the rocks that are there have been around for that long. Well, now you're talking about tens of millions, 20, dozens of millions of years. I guess that fits with tens of millions of years. Maybe up to 100 million years of time for this whole valley to have gathered enough dust from pulverized rocks to get to the valley floor we have today. There's no way to explain that with any young Earth creationist model, right? This is a flood geology failure. Flood geology does not help anyone explain this particular site. It should be an enigma to young Earth creationists. But to make my point here, and to help, well, not to help Ken Coulson, to augment Ken Coulson's statements, you can't expect a scientist, a geologist, to go to a location like this and to look out and use some basic tools to try to figure out what happened here, what's the origin of these rocks, and to come to the conclusion that, oh, these rocks all formed within the last 4,000 years. Right? That's not that's not what the evidence suggests. The obvious, easy interpretation, the most parsimonious explanation, the simplest explanation for the present appearance of these rocks is that they have formed over very, very large lengths of time. Young Earth creationists can say, well, that's not true. I know that these rocks only had about 4,000 years to come to be the way that they are. And so I am going to take that evidence and I'm going to try to find ways to readjust the interpretation of that data in order to fit it into 4,000 years. But it's not going to be the simplest explanation. But how do I know that? Because no one's come up with a simpler explanation that fits into 4,000 years, right? There's no, I have not heard anyone, and I've used this example in my blog many times. I've never heard young Earth creationists respond to this one. Right? I've never heard anyone come up with a hypothesis that sounds even remotely feasible and would convince one other young Earth creationist that that could have happened. And so this is a place where you're walking around, you look at, just like you look into the Grand Canyon, you don't immediately come to the conclusion these are young. You come to the conclusion that these certainly look like they've been around for a long time. All right, that's the end of my story. Like I said, I'll probably go into this particular story in a little more detail. I'll bring up the papers, we'll look at the actual estimates and look at some more pictures and probably go through the actual hypotheses and see if we can, I'll just try to make this particular, I want to make a bigger deal out of this example. And there's some other places in the Atacama Desert that also have similar features, geological features, which are fascinating because they clearly are made by wind. And again, extrapolating the rate at which you have to erode things by wind results in millions of years as well. All right, that's it for me today. That's my rambling dialogue. We'll talk to you later. Bye-bye.